welcome into the podcast. There's a lot going on in the world right now. There's immigration issues, tariffs, trade deals, defunding government departments. But today I want to zero in on something that Vice President Vance said in a recent interview. He said something that created quite a stir on X, especially in the Christian community. So let's take a moment just to listen to what he said when he was asked about immigration.
But you know, kids similar age to my children who were murdered by criminal aliens in the United States of America. And as an American leader, but also just as an American citizen, your compassion belongs first to your fellow citizens. It doesn't mean you hate people from outside of your own borders, but there's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. A lot of the far left has completely inverted that. They seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about people outside their own borders. That is no way to run a society. And I think the profound difference that Donald Trump brings to the leadership of this country is the simple concept, America first. It doesn't mean you hate anybody else. It means that you have leadership. And President Trump has been very clear about this, that puts the interests of American citizens first. In the same way that the British Prime Minister should care about Brits and the French should care about the French, we have an American president who cares primarily about Americans, and that's a very welcome change.
Okay, my goal is not necessarily to defend a party or a particular policy, but to analyze just his comments biblically. And so Vance breaks down this concept that your first commitment is to your family, and then to your neighbor, and then to your community, and then to your country. And then after that, you can focus on the rest of the world. And so the debates over these comments were pretty intense this week. Some people saying that he's exactly right. Some people saying that it's the most unchristian thing you could possibly say. Many people are pointing to Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan to make the case that Jesus actually took the opposite approach. And so we're going to come back to that. But what I want to do, first of all, is just dive into what the Bible says on this issue. Is this a selfish, non-Christian focus, or is he correct that this is a Christian concept? So let's start in 1 Timothy 5:8. 1 Timothy 5:8 says this. Paul's writing, and he says, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Paul's talking about taking care of needs inside the church, and he says that, first of all, families should take responsibility for themselves. No widows, he says, should be put on the list that the church needs to care for if they still have family that should be taking care of them. Now imagine that, accountability for how shared funds are spent. But he's very, very clear that it is an extreme shame to someone to not first and foremost care for their family. When we talk about the idea that this is a Christian concept, Paul literally says, if you don't take this approach, you have denied the faith. You're going against Christianity if first and foremost you're not taking care of your family. And so, you know, the question that a lot of people have asked is, if your child is starving and yet you know somebody across town is starving, who do you feed first? Who do you prioritize giving shelter to? If you don't have a house for your kids to live in, renting, buying, whatever, like you don't have shelter over your kid's head, are you going to prioritize with that first down payment or that first deposit and first month's rent? Are you going to prioritize somebody else, or are you going to prioritize your family? The answer to that is obvious, and that's exactly what Paul's appealing to here. And so along those same lines, when Paul gives instructions about qualifications for pastors and elders, in 1 Timothy 3, he says this, that the pastor or the elder must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of respect. And then he puts in parentheses, if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? Again, you see these concentric circles that first and foremost, your responsibility is to your family. Here's a person that's responsible for an entire group of people. And you know, again, the Bible says in other places that pastors will give an account for those people that he's led. So that's serious. That's a priority. Like, he's got to worry about that. But before worrying about those responsibilities, Paul says it's important that he first and foremost focus on shepherding his own family. They are his number one priority. Jesus told his disciples that the world would be impacted by how his disciples love each other. Isn't that interesting? He says in John 13:35, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. If you can't love the people that you see, then your words about loving other people don't mean anything. You should first and foremost be able to show that you love the people that are right in front of you. Galatians 6:4 says each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one of you should carry their own load. Nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. Let us not become weary, skipping down to verse 9, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. This passage is interesting because Paul's talking about keeping each other accountable, in a sense, taking responsibility for what you are seeing in your friends' lives. But here he says, first of all, take responsibility for yourself. Make sure you're bearing your own burdens. Don't make it so that someone else would need to come look after you. And then he says, do good to all people, but especially focus on those people who are in your faith circle. So he's not saying that you can't do good beyond that, or you should not do good beyond that. He says you should. But he says first, take care of the people who are just right around you in the church. And then we have a passage like 1 John 4:20. He says, for whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. So this passage taps into this overall principle that we're starting to see develop here as we look at these passages, that we can't talk about love for God or love for someone far away that we really don't see if we aren't showing love to the people who are right in front of us. And so it's very easy to talk about loving someone else, somewhere, but it's hard to walk across the street and forgive someone that has hurt you. And that is expressing love. Mike Winger had a great quote on this. He said, hypothetical love for people you will never meet is just a way of hating the people that you know. A person who loves the people around them really, really well will be probably the most loving person as well beyond those circles. So let's get into some of the passages that people are using to say that this idea isn't biblical at all. And so, as I said earlier, the passage that seems to be most used by the people who don't think that Vice President Vance was correct in what he said here is the parable that Jesus told about the Good Samaritan. And so people are saying in that parable, Jesus actually demonstrated the opposite of what Vance is saying. When Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he said, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But some in the crowd were kind of looking for a loophole, right? So they said, well, who's my neighbor? And so Jesus tells a story of a man that was robbed and beaten, and the people closest to him came by and found reasons not to stop and help him. But this Samaritan, who would have not really been considered a part of this Jewish community, chose to stop and care for him, an outsider, if you will. And so Jesus is making the point that we don't discriminate based on external factors of who our neighbor is. We just help and serve those that God puts in front of us when we have opportunity. That's your neighbor. You have an opportunity, that's your neighbor. So because the Samaritan was not part of their community, many are using this parable to say that Jesus actually wanted us to care more for foreigners than for the people around us. And so Jesus therefore taught the opposite of what Vice President Vance said. Now, there are a bunch of problems with this idea. First of all, there's no indication that the Samaritan that helped in this situation chose to do so to the exclusion of caring for his own family or his own community. The implication is that other people came by and also had the time and the opportunity to help, but they just chose not to. But this guy had a little time Eventually, he had to get on to some other things, so he left him in the care of someone else. And he had the resources to help this guy, and he was willing to sacrifice some of what he had to help this gentleman. So this guy is applauded by Jesus for helping someone that God put in front of him, even though he probably had less responsibility and certainly less emotional desire, I would think, to help this person, especially then compared to the others that went by. And so, in a sense, this parable is based on the idea that those who know you and live around you should be ashamed if they don't care for their neighbors, because they would be expected to do that before people from other places would be expected to. So this whole parable is somewhat founded on the idea that Jesus is kind of shaming the people who are right around him and said, you know what, today I don't consider this guy my neighbor. And so Jesus is actually making the point that you should consider yourself to be a neighbor to anyone that God puts in front of you. And again, pretty much shaming the people who really were this guy's neighbor and did not pay attention to his needs. So let's just review a couple points from this parable. First of all, Jesus is pointing out that those that were in this guy's community, the guy who was robbed, should have cared for him. The fact that the Samaritan helped does not mean he prioritized this man more than he did his own family or his community. This doesn't teach that at all. And number 3, God warns us to care for people that he puts, or not, God wants us, not warns us, to care for people that he puts right in front of us and he makes us aware of. And I say aware of because, in a sense, your neighbor can be global. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But so we'll come back to this at the end. Now, also Mark 30:31 is another passage that people have been using in this debate. It says there, then Jesus' mothers and brothers arrived, and standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And Jesus said, who are my mother and brothers? And that's what he asked. And then he looked at those seated in the circle around him, and he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. And so Jesus said, who are my brothers and sisters and mother? And you know, here he's talking about his mission, right? They're seeking to divert him from what his father is calling him to do. And so this goes along with the passage that says that your love for God should make your love for your family look like hate. It's just a comparison thing. It's not saying you hate your family, right? It's saying your love for God should make your love for your family look like hate. And so Jesus is just saying that God the Father is absolutely first in this moment. This actually goes along with what Vice President Vance was saying. The only problem with this statement is he doesn't actually mention God first. He starts with family, community, that kind of thing, works out from there. And that's probably because he was only focusing on the order of human relationships. So there was no need to mention God necessarily in that. And maybe he would have said otherwise, or maybe he wouldn't have. Like we don't know. I'm not trying to judge his heart, but just make an observation. He didn't actually mention God as the first priority and then out from there. But he isn't saying, I no longer have responsibility for my family. Jesus is not saying that in this passage. So let me make one more point as I wrap up. I've said this many times, but there is a difference between government responsibility and individual responsibility. And when it comes to immigration, which was the topic that Vance was talking about, Christians should care for the people that God puts in front of them or makes them aware of. If you have immigrants that live next to you, it's not your job to worry about their status. It's your job to love them and care for them. Now, if you have reason to suspect that they're not here for good purposes, they're here for nefarious purposes, then just like you would do with any criminal enterprise that you feel like is living next to you, you would probably alert the authorities about that, right? So if you feel like that there's human trafficking or something like that going on, then yeah, you should tell somebody. But otherwise, you should just love those people, right? If a missionary comes to your church and makes you aware of, and that's the term I said earlier, God puts in front of you or you become aware of. We live in a global world now where we're able to know about and then somewhat become responsible for needs that are not right in front of us but are actually around the world. So if a missionary comes to your church and makes you aware of a need that you can help with, you should jump on board with that. You should decide, I'm going to be a neighbor to those people in Uganda, right? But you should care for your family first. You should invest heavily in your community because that's where you have the most influence for Jesus. But you should also leave margin in your life to bless other people, bless causes around the world, and maybe even spend some of your time to go and help folks around the world. That's a Christian's responsibility. But the government is in charge of keeping people safe. You can catch my whole immigration episode if you want to scroll back through all the episodes and check out that full explanation. But as Christians, we should support our government in taking that responsibility seriously. So that's the paradox for Christians, and that's where most Christians are just looking at this very simplistically and just trying to solve it without talking about both sides of the issue. We see immigration as an opportunity to serve and reach people who God puts right in front of us. But at the same time, we do support the government doing its job of knowing who is coming into our country and properly vetting them. So when I said, I would come back to the principles that we got from the Good Samaritan, here's the thing. The Good Samaritan is not a parable about the responsibility of government. It's about personal responsibility for your neighbor. So that's my breakdown on JD Vance's comments. It's hard to find a biblical problem necessarily with what he said. He may not have broken out all the nuances that we talked about here, so maybe it could be misunderstood. Maybe he meant a little something different than how I'm taking it. I'm not sure. But I would love to hear your comments. If you found this helpful, make sure that you like and share it with somebody else, and we will see you next Friday.